Hey, so Steve and I are going to do a series of podcasts with video associated with it on how to build a map with a specific layer and then how to take that layer and show it in various different types of output format. For example, in the fire service, we do a lot of infield collection. And so we're going to focus on building a damage assessment layer with applications and dashboards associated with that layer. And so this is going to be kind of similar to if you watch shows like This Old House, where they have a series of episodes geared towards finishing or remodeling a house. In each episode, you learn something a little bit different. For example, you'll learn about plumbing, or you learn something about kitchen cabinets, or learn something about drywall, or something else. And so we're going to do something similar, but it's going to be focused on building a damage assessment app with maps associated and dashboards associated. So, so we're going to focus on keeping it simple, and the goal is not to make the viewer or the listener GIS experts on how to build the application, and give you some tips and tricks on how to communicate, either building it or communicate to somebody else who can build it for you. So,
and the other idea behind these series of podcasts is the beginning ones, like building the layer for a damage assessment, is a little bit technical. But as the podcast series continues, we're going to get into other applications like Survey 123 and the Collector app, or a web-based map to be able to view the data. And these are applications that users, public safety users, can view the data, add to the data, collect data. The point of the podcast is for the non-technical public safety personnel. So eventually we're going to get into these apps that the non-technical person can use and be able to build up the data within these different layers.
So if you look on the screen, if you're watching the video, you'll see that we're using a program called ArcGIS Pro. You don't necessarily need this program. You could use ArcGIS Desktop. You could use the open source version called QGIS. If you don't have access to this application, you could just design it like in Excel or write it down. The goal is to kind of write down or plan precisely how you want a certain layer, what information that you want to collect. So let's say, for example, if you were to design something to collect hydrant information, you would want to create a point layer, and some certain attributes associated with that hydrant could be like the manufacturer, the number of ports, what type of ports are on the hydrant, the style of thread, what is the flow of the fire hydrant, what is the pressure of that fire hydrant, and even condition, like is it good condition, is it poor condition, etc. So you need to kind of think ahead on how you design and plan the layer that information you want to collect and what the geometry is. And in previous episodes, we talked about that you have basically three general types of vector type layers: points, lines, and polygons. Most features can, if they have an X, Y location, like a hydrant, a structure, any other point location, you're not moving around at all, can be defined with a point. And then things with lines include things like streets, trails, streams,
rail lines,
etc. And then polygons could be also structures if you zoom in close enough, but could be landmarks like parks, parcel boundaries, jurisdiction boundaries, etc. So the first thing you need to do is define and decide what type of geometry you want to use. In this example, we're going to stick with points because that's the simplest. Actually, it's probably the most common, broadly used geometry shape or style for collecting point information. So the next thing you want to worry about is, what data do I want to collect? And so in this case, with this example, Steve and I are going to banter back and forth a little bit, but we're going to kind of narrow it down to three or four things we want to collect. So, if we were doing a damage assessment, let's assume you want to collect damage associated with a natural event like an earthquake or a hurricane. So, yeah,
And I think, Chris, that, damage assessment's an important point layer to be collected. And the listeners think about all the things that go on in this country as far as disasters. Damage assessment is always going to be pretty much one of the layers that you want to collect.
yeah,
Most recent, just the other day was the tornadoes down in Alabama, all the, structures that were damaged, so here's a perfect point layer for a user to go out and be able to start collecting information on a mobile device
hmm,
and collecting this damage assessment. But it could be applied to earthquakes, hurricanes, a terrorist attack, any sort of disaster. A damage assessment is going to be very important. We talked a few episodes back about, GIS preparedness and having certain data on hand, like road center lines and address points. But here's a point layer that you can develop without any data in it and have it as a template, and then just be able to load it up into your database and push it out online and have it ready to go in a moment's notice.
absolutely. And also, the other big goal today is to get your head around the fact that you want to structure your information or data. But let's say, for example, you don't even have any technology at all. You want to just go collect information, damage assessment, and say you want to just write it on paper. You still need to, for practical purposes, you need to structure it so you can communicate that to the next person. And in the fire service, we're actually kind of geared towards communicating effectively using common language, common terminology, all based on ICS. We've learned over the years that we need to use the same language on the fire ground or during an emergency incident so that one person can communicate something, the same intent to the next person. And that kind of extends even to automatic and mutual aid and external resources coming in to help you out with your emergency. Everybody needs to be on the same platform, the same language, using the same terms so that we all understand each other. It's the same thing with collecting data. You want to be consistent in the way you collect data, and so that you can uh, communicate effectively to the next person, whether they're part of your jurisdiction or somebody else coming in. When we do this demonstration, we talk over it. The same thing applies to if you're writing it down on a piece of paper. You want to have like the date, what kind of category that you want to assess, and some comments, and then perhaps something else associated with that. So just think about that this is not necessarily a technology thing. This is more of being organized and communication thing. So you'll see here on the map that I have a aerial photo with a GIS program open. Again, like we talked about, you can use a piece of paper. But I'm going to design a point layer to collect damage assessment information. And in GIS, that's stored in a database of some kind, a GIS-based database. In this platform, they call it a geodatabase, but it could be a shapefile. If you're a bit older, you can have it like a coverage file. It could be KML, but KML has some challenges because it's not as structured as a firm geodatabase or database. And so in this instance, we're going to use what's called a geodatabase. So you see here, if you're watching the video on the right pane, I have like tools that I can use to create a database. And you'll see that I have a database, and then underneath that database name, I have a point layer already established. And I just created a blank database feature class with no values in it whatsoever. So I call it just damage assessment. So then I want to design that database. And here I'm going to do it directly in the GIS software ArcGIS Pro. But if you don't have access to this, write it down and design it. So some of the attributes or the things you want to consider are, what are the values I want to collect? What is the field name I want to name it? What data type it's associated with this? So for example, there are several data types in various different programs, and even like on a paper form, you want to have a consistent data type. For example, there's a data type, so you have a date value associated with it. You have text, you have number data types. Some of those number values include integer, which are just digits without any decimals, and you have floating or double digits, which are numbers with decimals. Other unique data types, you have what's called like blob formats or image formats, but we'll kind of keep it simple to date, text, and the number.
And I think it's important for somebody who's going to write stuff down or maybe put it into an Excel spreadsheet for a GIS professional to design the layer. It's important for the end user to think about the data that they want to collect about damage assessment. Chris and I have already discussed, and we're going to demonstrate about the severity of the damage to a structure.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also other important information, such as, maybe the street name that the structure is on, the type of structure, if it's a taxpayer, is it a residence, is it a multi-dwelling, is it an industrial building? These are things that public safety personnel are pretty much very aware of, but it's things that like this that should be thought about that you want to go into your data. GIS isn't just a map with points, lines, or polygons on it. What makes this rich is that there's data behind that point, and you could easily click the info button on a point and find out information about that building, or find out information about that roadway, or find out information about that fire hydrant. That's what makes GIS such a valuable tool. And just as those, information about a hydrant, such as, gallons per minute and stuff like that, damage assessment is just as important, where you want to think about what data you want to see when you click on a point that's on top of a building.
Exactly. So, for this example, we'll go through and we'll just pick out about 4 or 5 fields we want to collect. And Steve and I will kind of go randomly a little bit. I'm going to start with adding a field. Again, this is just like writing it down. I'm going to add a date field. So I'm going to name it date value. And then you'll see here, I have what's called an alias in this software. And what an alias is, a field name is always a single word, so it has no spaces or no special characters. So it has to be like a firm text value. An alias can be a little bit more free floating, so I'll say date of collection. So that's more descriptive, and that's what shows up in the database in a lot of the software that to the end user. And date value, so you see here the options I have for different value types. You see like the 2 short integer, long integer, floating, and double, which are basically just decimals. You'll see date, and then you'll see text. I'm going to make this a date value, and then it's going to default to this. Now, what's something else you maybe want to collect there, Steve?
Well, as I mentioned, we could collect structure type.
Mm-hmm. So it's structure, and you do str type, do it that way. The structure type, and what would you say? Text?
Yeah, definitely text. And again, this is something that the GIS professional has to be very careful about.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to make the text field too long, because it's even empty spaces in the database is going to eat up space on your hard drive. But you don't want to make it too short. Let's say if you made the length 5, you want to put in the word taxpayer, it's not going to let you put in the word taxpayer because the length is too short.
Exactly. So we'll kind of can it. Usually I use the number 32. Sometimes people use 50, but 32 is kind of a magic number that we kind of go over here in a little bit. I'll add another field, and it's going to be another text value. I'll say damage category. And I kind of shorten things up a bit to make it easy to type. I go damage category. And this is going to be another text value as well. And I'm going to make it 32 for the length. And the one thing that this GIS program has is it has the ability to create drop-down menus. They call them domains in the Esri environment. Some other programs might handle it just a little bit differently, but they're called domains in ArcGIS. So I have a domain of categories, and this is actually important to know about, because when you create categories of collecting damage information, this is just like something you use to create like a checkbox of is it this, or this, and you want to constrain it so that it's only those 4 categories. One of the challenges with having free-form text is you can't do analysis, or you can't like ask the data questions on what is the problem or what is here. So if you have somebody, like a common example is, if you have, we'll go back to structure type. I may call, Steve may call it a taxpayer in his location. My locale in the fire service, they're kind of, we call them like, the local term is 5/1s. I know that's not standard, but we have so many buildings that are type 5 construction over type 1 construction, or the pedestal type construction, that we just gotten used to naming them 5/1s, but they're basically roughly the same thing. There's residential on top and businesses on the bottom floor. And so, one thing that's important to realize is that, you want to constrain the data so that this is all you can enter, so that you have consistency across the board. So in this scenario, I created a domain called damage assessment, and with the description. And then in this window, I have 4 categories I want to collect. And this is consistent to the USAR damage symbology. So when they collect damage information after a hurricane or earthquake, they have 4 categories. There are a lot of other categories. I'm not advocating any particular one. This is just an example I used. They use, is a structure not damaged? Is it partially damaged or damaged? So for example, is a window broken, or is it obviously damaged, it's cracked? Did it fail? So did it partially collapse but didn't fully collapse? Or is it totally destroyed, meaning it just flat fell to the ground? So those are the 4 categories we use to tie in with the database. So going back to,
Actually, Chris, can we also put in another domain there?
sure.
Let's put in structure type.
Okay, yeah, so do structure type. So I'm going to
And the
design.
other thing I like to do when I create my domains, and now a damage assessment is going to be pretty straightforward. But one of the things I like to do when I create my domains is always have an other category.
Yeah.
So here in structure type, Chris could put in residential, he could put in taxpayer, he could put in multi-dwelling, and then I would always at the end have other, just in case, somebody comes across a building and we don't have that domain in the building, they cannot add it. So you could always default to that other category.
That makes a lot of sense. So let me I added 4 categories. There's a lot more. I'll just keep it, I spell industrial, right? And the most important, industrial, what happens when you have 2 firemen doing technical work. And then other.
The other field is a catch-all, and then you could also have another field. Say I like to have a field in there called comments.
Yep.
So somebody, if they do have to pick other for structure type, they could put in the comments, which would be a free form field that they could enter any data. They can put hotel or some sort of other structure that they marked other for.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good point. The big key takeaway with that is, like, with a lot of the fields are constrained, they kind of keep them small. A comments field would be a text field, but it'd be the full extent of the length. So usually that would be like right around 255. So let me tie in structure type to the structure type field, and damage assessment to the damage assessment field. And we'll add the comments field that Steve talked about. And make a text as well. And we'll just keep that 255 so it's extra long. Can you think of anything else to add here, Steve, or is that pretty good to go?
Well, some of the other fields I would add, especially for a damage assessment, is name, or collector name. So in other words, the person, collecting the data would enter their name, so we know who collected the data.
Okay.
And we're not going to go too crazy here, but standard practice would be, an edited by or edit name.
Yeah.
So this way, if Chris went out and he collected damage assessment, and maybe the building that initially collected had minor damage,
Hmm.
but then over the course of the 4 days, because of this tornado or an earthquake or a hurricane, something else happened, and now that building collapsed.
Yeah.
So now if I go back out as a secondary assessment, I can actually edit that point,
Yep.
change the category, and then in the edit by field, I would put my name. So we would know that it was originally collected by Chris, but I then went out and edited that data.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a pretty healthy database right here. Let's keep it simple for the end's sake, but you could add like a number field, like number of victims, the maybe have a severity category. So anything you want to do a calculation on, you can do that as well. Some damage assessment layers I've seen assign a score. So if you had this, this, and this, you create a script to calculate a score, and actually what's represented is not the, in this case on our map will be the full category of damage assessment. It could be a score that's given, so it gives decision makers a different way of looking at things. There's plenty of options and ways of doing this. For this demonstration, we're just going to keep it simple, keep it to text. So I think that's a pretty good database right there, don't you think, Steve?
Definitely.
All right. So I'll tell you, so the next thing we're going to do is, we just need to bring in our maps. So I have this database that's designed, and I could add the layer a number of different ways, but I'm just going to drag it into a map. And you'll see here, I have on top of this map what it is a training area I found that has some damaged buildings. So you'll see some collapsed buildings here and some structures that are fully intact. This is actually an emergency management training area. And if somebody wants to guess what it is in the comment, I'll tell you if it's right or not. So play hide and seek or find the location. So you see here in my map table of contents, now I actually have that layer on the map. And I'm going to add a few points to it. So I'm going to collect some information associated with it just to populate the map. I'm not going to do anything specific, but I'm going to add, obviously this building is really damaged. This building seems to be intact. This building may be partially damaged, and this building might have no damage at all. So I'm going to collect information on that, and I'm going to adjust the attributes of those features. And you'll see I have the database that I designed and the four or five fields I use to collect the information. And most tools have either drop-down options, say it's a taxpayer, the category it's not damaged at all, and some comments, good access. And then I'm going to do the same for the other features as well. I'm going to add some attributes associated with it. But what do you think the main problem with this map is, Steve?
Well, one of the things is you just have regular points in there, which aren't very visually descriptive.
Yep.
So, as we talked about in other episodes about standardized symbology, we want to try to make maps that a printed map, yes, you're going to have a legend. A web-based map, you're going to have a legend. Even on the mobile applications, there's legends. But we want to try to keep it as simple as possible, especially with standardized symbology. So whether you're from New York or Kirkland, Washington, when you look at that map, you know exactly what that icon is representing about that building.
Exactly. And, actually for the symbology we're going to use today, we're going to use the USAR standard symbology. If I type in, everybody knows, both Steve and I are pretty heavily involved with the NAPSG Foundation symbology effort. And so there's actually a lot of symbols online that you could use, consume. And we're using the USAR symbology, and we're going to use these four symbols right here. So you're going to see the green one has no damage, the yellow one has some damage, the red one's totally destroyed, and the orange one indicates some kind of building failure. So we're going to use those four symbols. And what's neat about this tool is you can download the TrueType fonts, the PNGs, or the SVGs associated with it. So this is a pretty helpful tool on using standardized or consistent symbology based on user feedback to create a map. Fortunately, I'm not going to download it. It'll take too much time. for this demonstration, but I actually have this already on my computer. So I'm going to adjust the symbols associated with this layer. So each program has their own thing. You could do this even in Google Earth, the old version of Google Earth to a certain extent, but not as easily. But you can do it in QGIS, you can do it in ArcGIS Desktop, if you have it in GeoMedia or MapInfo. All these programs can make a symbol based on a certain category. So I'm going to make the symbol symbolize that layer based on a unique value in each category. And the field that I use is the damage assessment or damage category. And often it'll auto-populate the information on the map. And you'll see here that the symbols change, the symbol color changes, the dots change to different colors. And that's fine, but I actually wanted to use some consistent symbology. So I'm going to pick, it's going to take a little bit of work, so just bear with me a little bit. But I'm going to add and do a shortcut. But you'll see here, I'm going to format all the symbols a certain way. Okay, so one of the things is the magic of television, and you know how you have a cooking show and you want to save some time, so you actually do some prep work ahead of time. So we took a little pause real quick just to set up the symbols and have the symbols designed and set up. But one of the things we did is we just downloaded the symbology off the NAPSG website, brought it into the program, so you actually have to set the program up to support that symbology. And I actually designated some of the symbols ahead of time. So you'll see here on the map, you'll see 4 points. You'll see 2 generic points. One of the buildings obviously damaged, and perhaps there's some buildings that have some destruction to it as well. 2 of the symbols are a little bit more descriptive. They're a diamond that's colored with a symbol inside it. The 2 other ones, you just have no clue. Matter of fact, they're the same color. And one part of the challenge of making a good map is to have it so that you have the map communicating in an instant what the problem is. So in my table of contents, you'll see here that the destroyed symbol is the big symbol. So I'm going to click on that symbol, format that symbol. And in this program, I have a gallery that's associated with it. And so I'm going to narrow the search down just a bit. And I have what is the destroyed symbol that's consistent with the USAR symbology. All I'm going to do is click on it, and you'll see that all of a sudden that point changes the map. The neat thing about this is, and with GIS versus any other software application like CAD or like some graphics program that you might use to diagram or represent something, is that if I add more features to the map, it's going to use the same exact symbol. And if I want to change that symbol based on a category, all the symbol will change. So if I use, like, say, for example, a program called Visio to mark up a map, and I want to use, like, make a simple hydrant map using Visio, which honestly is a pretty time-consuming process at this point. And I drag some icons from the palette onto the map that's a certain hydrant design. If I want to change that, I actually have to go back, delete each hydrant on that map, and redo it over again. With GIS, you're just collecting the location, which is always being the same, and then based on the output and design of the map, you change the symbol. The final thing here is I will change the final feature to a no damage category. So I'll just click on that. You'll see that I have the same consistent symbology for destroyed, failed, damage, and no damage at all. The other neat thing is now that I set my map up to have this consistent symbol, the symbol in the drag and drop that create features template stays the same. Now I have the option of saying, okay, you know what? I'm going to go through, I would see this building is not damaged, this building's not damaged, this building's not damaged, this building's not damaged. Then I might go, well, you know what, it looks like it's destroyed over here, it's bad over here, and I might have a failure right here. So you see that when I add features to the map, it maintains the same attributes. If I open up the attribute box or the spreadsheet, it has that consistent data value associated with it. And then again, for each attribute that I collect, I could add a comment to it, collected by, say, Chris, and the structure type, the taxpayer. So what's represented on the map is the one field category or feature category, damage category, some comments, and then the date collected. This software, it actually has drop-down options to view the date that's current. So, and
So
that's
again, this is why the symbology is important, because this symbol set is actually has been designated as a standard by FEMA. So all search and rescue teams are using this symbology. So again, if you're on a USAR team from New York or from LA, or as we had our interview with Virginia Task Force 1, all these USAR teams are using this symbol. So there's really not much thought behind, or there's no thought at all. They know that the green diamond is no damage to that structure.
so you see here in a matter of time, I was able to mark up my map based on the consistent symbology, and now I have a good starting point. Some of the other things to worry about, to consider on a map is, do you want a label associated with it? You want, so for example, I can set up this map to have a label based on the structure type. So I'm going to label the map so it's going to be this structure damage assessment layer, and I'm going to pick a drop down of the structure type, and I'm going to label it. And all of a sudden, you see I did add some values to it, and so as a taxpayer. So one thing you might want to consider in your map design or your visioning of how you want your product to look is like, what layer do I want to represent? How do I want to represent it? What's the label? And you can get pretty complex. So I would recommend keeping it simple. And you also might want to represent at what point on the map do I want to see the layer. So for example, if I zoom out, zoom all the way out, and this gives you an idea where it's at, you'll see, clear it real quick. You'll see that all I see is a single dot, but in reality, it's all the dots jammed up on top of each other. I have no reference or capability to understand what that layer means. Does it mean that there's one damaged feature? Does it mean that there's a lot of failed features? And yet, if you zoom in underneath, you'll start seeing that some of the points actually jumble together. It still doesn't tell me much. So you have to consider in the final output at what scale level I want us to see this map or this information. And it's all dependent on what the density is of the information you're collecting. In this example, since it's a pretty tight community, I'm going to set the appearance. I'm going to have this layer shut off out beyond a certain point. So I'm sorry, I did it backwards. So I'm going to say to 1 to 24,000, this thing's going to shut off. No, I was right before. After years of doing this, I still make mistakes between large scale and small scale. So you see that I zoom in, you see all the features are still present. So if I zoom out, in this case, you'll see the scale level down below. It's 1 to 13,000. When I get to 1 to 24,000, it disappears. And that's very helpful just to keep that clean and consistent. So most GIS folks will understand this, and you just if you're a lay user, just consider the fact that, hey, I don't want to see these layers past a certain level on the map. It could be 1 to 24,000. You could give a reference of, hey, if I'm 2 miles up or 3 miles up, I don't want to see that layer because it's just too busy. And most knowledgeable people in regards to making a map will kind of give you some advice or feedback on what level you want to show that information.
So Chris, zoom in a little bit to the symbols. This is a good map of damage assessment. As we mentioned, you could clearly see the level of damage to each structure based on the color. As we mentioned, as we were building out the attributes, we could see, okay, we have, two structures that are taxpayers. One has some minor damage and one has no damage based on the symbol color and the labels. Right there, it's a very informative map. Now, Chris, you can have numerous attributes or information about that point. So how are we going to see that? Because, we're just symbolizing the point and labeling it based on one of the fields, but Chris could actually now use the info tool, click on that point, and we can then see all the information that's been collected about that building. We could instantly see the date that it was collected, the structure type, which we're using as part of the label, the damage category of no damage. We put in that comments field, which is a free floating field, so the user can enter any sort of information. Again, if we had an other category, they could enter in comments there about that other information that we didn't have in the drop-down menu. And then also the collected by, so we know who collected the data.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good place to kind of wind up for today a little bit. So you can see here, we designed a feature class or a small little database that collected a specific set of information. We were able to symbolize it in a consistent format that was based on an existing guideline. And we were able to design a map that has some flexibility to it. But the biggest challenge with this, Steve?
What?
Is that it's stuck on my computer and I don't share it with anybody, and nor do I have any access to it. So you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna entice the viewers and listeners to wait till next time to find out how I'm able to share the workload of editing this information, the data collection, and use the information that's collected in a way that's a little bit more simple to the lay user to understand in a follow-up dashboard. So till then,
this is Chris and Steve.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mapping Tech and Public Safety. Please visit our blog at mappingtechandpublicsafety.com.